New York City is famous for a lot of things. It is known for its bright yellow taxis, the towering skyscrapers that scrape the sky, and the constant, never-ending noise of millions of people living their lives all at once. But mostly, it is known for moving fast. In this city, everyone seems to be in a hurry. People walk with their heads down, checking their phones, or rushing to their next meeting, rarely looking up to see the world around them. It is very easy to feel invisible in a place like this, lost in the crowd of busy strangers. However, on this particular afternoon, the person who was the most invisible was also the person who the whole world probably knew the best. It was a regular Tuesday. Late in the afternoon, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. On a quiet street corner, away from the loudest tourist spots, there sat a small bakery. It wasn't a fancy place with velvet ropes or expensive prices. It was a simple shop with a glass front filled with the smell of fresh bread, sugar, and warm coffee. This was the kind of place where locals stopped to grab a quick treat, where the floor was a little dusty from flour, and the bell above the door chimed happily whenever someone walked in, when the door to this little shop swung open. The man who entered didn't look like a movie star. He didn't have a large entourage of bodyguards blocking the entrance. There were no flashing cameras or screaming fans outside. He walked in alone, dressed in clothes that looked like they had seen better days. He wore a simple dark t-shirt, a pair of well-worn jeans that fit him comfortably, and a baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. His boots were old and scuffed at the toes, suggesting he had walked a long way to get there. If you had just glanced at him quickly, you might have thought he was just another guy who had finished a long shift at work. He looked tired, but not in a bad way. He looked peaceful. His shoulders were relaxed, and he didn't have that stressed-out look that so many people in the city carry on their faces. He closed the door gently behind him, taking a moment to let his eyes adjust to the softer light inside the shop. The smell of cinnamon and baking dough seemed to make him smile just a little bit. A small private smile that was barely there. Inside the shop, the atmosphere was busy but warm. There were a few people in line ahead of him. A young woman in a business suit was tapping her foot impatiently, looking at her watch. An older man was reading a newspaper, leaning against the counter while he waited for his coffee. The staff behind the counter were moving quickly, calling out orders and sliding trays of pastries into paper bags. They were focused on their jobs, trying to keep up with the rush of customers who wanted their sugar fix before the evening set in. The man in the baseball cap stepped into the line. He stood quietly, keeping a polite distance from the woman in the suit. He didn't pull out his phone to scroll through social media or check emails. He just stood there, his hands resting loosely in his pockets. He watched the interaction between the customers and the staff with a look of genuine interest. It was as if he was happy just to be a normal person, waiting in line like everyone else. Interestingly, nobody in the shop seemed to recognize him. Or maybe they did, but they were respecting his space so much that they pretended not to. In New York, people are used to seeing famous actors, musicians, and athletes walking down the street. The general rule is that you let them be. But this man had such a humble energy about him that he blended in completely. He didn't demand attention. He didn't act like he owned the place. He just stood there, breathing in the sweet air, looking at the display case filled with delicious food. As he moved closer to the front of the line, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked down at the rows of croissants, muffins, and bagels behind the glass. They looked perfect. The pastries were golden brown and flaky. The donuts were covered in colorful sprinkles, and the bread loaves were crusty and warm. It was a feast for the eyes. He seemed to be thinking about what he might want to eat, chewing on his lips slightly as he made his decision. The staff behind the counter were young and tired. One of the workers, a guy with flour on his apron, was wiping down the counter near the register. He had a look of exhaustion on his face, the kind that comes from being on your feet for 8 hours straight. Another worker was in the back, organizing the shelves and getting ready for the end of the day. The bakery would be closing soon, and the rhythm of the shop was changing from the busy lunch rush to the slower cleanup phase of the evening. The man in the cap watched the staff. He didn't stare, but his eyes were observant. He noticed the way the worker wiped the counter with extra care, even though he looked tired. He noticed the way the other staff members communicated with each other, shouting out orders and joking around to keep their spirits up. There was a sense of community in this small bakery, a feeling of people working hard to make a living. He seemed to appreciate that. He wasn't just there to buy food. He was there to witness the life of the shop for a few minutes. Finally, it was his turn. The woman in the suit had grabbed her coffee and rushed out the door, letting it slam shut behind her. The man in the cap stepped up to the register. The bell above the door rang again as another customer left, leaving the shop a little quieter than before. He looked up from the display case and faced the cashier. He adjusted his cap slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind his ear, and prepared to speak. But before he could order a muffin or a coffee, something caught his eye. He looked past the cashier, toward the back room of the bakery. Through the open doorway, he could see what was happening next. The staff was beginning the process of closing down. They were pulling large metal trays out of the display cases. On these trays were dozens of pastries bagels that hadn't sold, donuts that were starting to look a little dry, and cookies that were left over from the morning batch. The man watched as they started to scrape this food into large trash bags. The sight made him stop. His easygoing smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. He tilted his head to the side, watching the routine, and realized that something was wrong with this picture. The food looked perfectly fine to him, and the idea that it was all about to be thrown in the garbage didn't sit right with him. He stood there for a moment, the silence growing between him and the cashier as he gathered his thoughts. He knew he couldn't just watch it happen without saying something. The silence in the small bakery didn't last very long. The noise of the city outside was muffled by the thick glass, but inside, the sounds of work continued. The staff was moving with a specific kind of energy now. The rush of customers had slowed down to a trickle, which meant the cleanup phase of the day had officially begun. For anyone who has ever worked in the food industry, this is a familiar time. It is when the workers shift from making things to throwing things away. It is a routine, a mechanical process that happens every single day, usually without anyone thinking twice about it. Standing at the counter, the man in the baseball cap watched this process unfold with a focus that was intense but quiet. He wasn't looking at the menu anymore. He wasn't looking at the prices. His gaze was fixed on the metal trays being pulled out of the glass display case. These trays were still heavy with food. There were golden bagels, croissants filled with chocolate, and muffins with blueberries bursting out of the tops. Just an hour ago, these items were worth money. People were happy to pay for them. But now, because the clock on the wall said it was closing time, their value had dropped to zero. One of the workers, a young guy wearing a white apron stained with coffee, walked past the register carrying a large tray. He didn't look at the customer standing there. He was focused on his task. He walked over to a large gray trash bin in the corner of the room. With a practiced motion, he tilted the tray. A cascade of pastries slid off the metal and disappeared into the dark plastic bag waiting below. There was a soft thud as the bread hit the bottom of the bin. It was a dull, heavy sound that seemed to echo in the quiet shop. The man at the counter flinched slightly. It wasn't a big movement, just a small tightening of his shoulders. He watched the young worker turn around and go back to the display case for another load. The worker moved quickly, trying to clear the space so he could wipe down the glass and go home. It wasn't that he was a cruel person who liked wasting food. He was just doing what he was told. In the world of bakeries, freshness is the law. If it isn't sold today, it cannot be sold tomorrow. That is just how the business works. But seeing it happen up close, watching so much food being discarded while people walked hungry just a few blocks away, painted a difficult picture. The customer shifted his weight. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the high counter. His eyes tracked the worker's every move. Another tray came out. This one was full of sandwiches. They were wrapped in plastic, looking perfect and ready to eat. Without unwrapping them to check if they were still good, the worker swept them into a cardboard box marked waste. The sight of the plastic wrapping crinkling as it hit the box seemed to bother the man deeply. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, a habit people often have when they are thinking hard or feeling troubled. The cashier, who was standing right in front of him, noticed the man's distraction. She stopped counting the coins in the register for a moment and looked at him. She saw that he wasn't looking at her, but past her into the back of the room. She followed his gaze and saw her coworker throwing away the bread. She looked back at the customer. She assumed he was just impatient or maybe wondering why they were cleaning up so early. She offered a polite, slightly tired smile, ready to take his order so he could be on his way. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked. Her voice was friendly but sounded a bit worn out from a long day of talking to people. The man didn't answer right away. He held up one finger gently, a signal that meant just a moment. Needed a few more seconds to understand what he was seeing. It wasn't just about the bread. It was about the principle of the thing. He knew the city outside. He knew that within a radius of just a few miles, there were shelters overflowing with people who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. He knew there were families struggling to put food on the table. To see this abundance, this literal pile of calories being treated like garbage, felt wrong to him on a fundamental level. It felt like a disconnect in the world that he couldn't ignore. He watched the worker come back with a third tray. This one held cookies and brownies. The worker was moving faster now, eager to finish the job. He tipped the tray, and the cookies tumbled into the bag, landing on top of the muffins and bagels from before. The trash bag was beginning to bulge, swelling with wasted food. The smell of sugar and yeast was still strong, but now it was mixed with the faint smell of trash from the bin. It was a strange collision of senses. The smell of something delicious, and the sight of something being discarded. The man in the cap finally looked away from the bin and turned his attention back to the cashier. The expression on his face was serious, but his eyes were kind. He didn't look angry at the staff. He knew they were just following the rules of their employer. He understood that they had bills to pay and bosses to answer to. He didn't want to get them in trouble. But he also knew that if he walked out of that door without saying anything, he would feel like he had missed an opportunity to fix a small piece of a big problem. He took a deep breath. The air in the bakery was warm and comforting, contrasting with the cold reality of the trash bag in the corner. He looked at the cashier, then passed her again to the remaining food in the display case. There were still a few items left. A couple of loaves of sourdough bread, some scones, and a few isolated pastries that hadn't made it into the trash yet. They were sitting there, glowing under the warm lights of the display, waiting for a customer who might never come. The man's mind was working fast. He was thinking about logistics. He was thinking about how much food was actually there and what it would take to save it. He wasn't a businessman, but he knew that food has value beyond money. It has value to a hungry stomach. He looked at the worker who was throwing the food away. The worker stopped to wipe sweat from his forehead, looking tired. The man felt a wave of empathy for him, too. It's hard work standing on your feet all day, dealing with customers, and then throwing away the very thing you worked hard to make. The customer reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was a simple, worn leather wallet. He didn't open it yet. He just held it in his hand, feeling the texture of the leather. He was grounding himself, getting ready to speak. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to be the celebrity who barges in and demands special treatment. He wanted to handle this as a human being. He's talking to other human beings. The cashier was still waiting, her pen hovering over the order pad. The background noise of the city, the honking horns and sirens, seemed to fade away for a moment. The bakery felt like a small bubble where a decision was about to be made. The man looked the cashier in the eyes. His gaze was steady and sincere. There was no hint of a joke or a prank. He was completely serious. The tension in the air was subtle, but it was there. It was the tension of a routine being interrupted, of the normal flow of things being stopped by a simple question. He cleared his throat softly. The worker in the background paused, sensing that something was happening at the register. He turned around, holding an empty tray, watching the interaction. The man in the cap looked from the cashier to the worker, and then back to the cashier. He didn't look at the food anymore. He looked at the people. He knew that people usually follow rules because they are used to them, but sometimes People are willing to break the rules if someone gives them a good reason and a kind way to do it. He was ready to speak now. The confusion and the hesitation were gone, replaced by a quiet determination. He was going to ask his question. It was a simple question, one that anyone could ask, but for some reason, nobody ever did. And the way he asked it would change the mood of the entire shop in an instant. The air in the bakery felt heavy, not because of the heat from the ovens, but because of the awkward silence that had settled over the room. The customer in the worn-out baseball cap was still standing at the counter, his hands resting lightly on the surface. He wasn't looking at his phone, and he wasn't looking out the window at the busy street. His eyes were locked on the young worker who was standing by the trash bin with a tray full of scones in his hands. The worker had paused, feeling the weight of the customer's stare. Unsure if he should continue his task or stop to see what the man wanted. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried a distinct firmness that cut through the ambient noise of the shop. It wasn't a loud voice. It was the kind of voice you use when you are speaking about something that actually matters to you. "Excuse me," he said, nodding his head slightly toward the tray in the worker's hands. "What are you going to do with those?" The question hung in the air for a second. It was such a strange thing to ask. Most customers ask about prices, or ingredients, or whether a sandwich has mayo on it. They don't usually ask about the trash. The young worker blinked, looking down at the tray of blueberry and lemon scones he was holding, then back up at the customer. He looked confused, a little crease forming between his eyebrows as he tried to figure out if this was a trick question or if the guy was just curious. These, the worker asked, holding the tray up a bit higher to show him. "We have to throw them away. We can't sell them tomorrow. It's the rules." The man at the counter didn't look away. He kept his eyes on the scones. They looked delicious. They were perfectly baked, with a dusting of sugar on top. To anyone walking in off the street, they would look like a treat worth buying. The idea that they were suddenly garbage just because the clock had hit a certain time seemed crazy to him. He shifted his weight, leaning a little closer to the counter, trying to bridge the gap between himself and the staff. "You throw them away?" he asked again. He sounded genuinely sad, like he had just heard some bad news. "All of them, even though they look perfectly fine?" The cashier, who was standing next to the register, chimed in. She was used to explaining this to people. Sometimes customers asked if they could get a discount on the day-old stuff, and she always had to say no. "Yeah, it's company policy," she explained with a sigh, leaning her elbows on the counter. "We're not allowed to sell anything that was made yesterday. We have to bake fresh every morning. It's about quality control. If we sell old stuff, we get in trouble." The man listened carefully. He nodded slowly, showing that he understood. He wasn't angry at the staff. He knew they weren't the ones making the rules. They were just the ones who had to follow them, even if it felt wrong. He looked back at the large trash bag in the corner. It was already half full with the previous trays. The plastic bag was stretching under the weight of the bread, and the sight of it made him feel a knot form in his stomach. He thought about how much effort went into making that food. The farmers who grew the wheat, the truck drivers who hauled it, the bakers who woke up at dawn to mix the dough and shape the loaves. All of that energy, all of that work, was ending up in a black plastic bag. "But there has to be a better way," he said softly. It wasn't really a question. It was more like he was thinking out loud. You can't just toss them. There are people outside who would love to eat these. The worker shrugged, looking a bit uncomfortable now. He hated wasting food, too. It was the worst part of his job. He loved baking, but throwing away what he made felt like a failure. "I know," he said, his voice lower now. "It sucks. I've asked the manager if we can donate them or something, but they say it's too much of a liability. If someone gets sick, they could sue. So, into the bin they go." He tilted the tray again, ready to finish the job. The scones began to slide toward the edge. The movement made the man at the counter step forward involuntarily. He didn't want to see them fall. He didn't want to hear that dull thud again. It was like watching someone destroy something beautiful for no reason. He looked at the cashier, then back at the worker. His expression changed from sad to determined. He wasn't just going to watch this happen. "Wait," he said. The word was sharp enough to make the worker freeze in mid-motion. The scones were balanced on the edge of the tray, half in, half out. The worker looked up, surprised by the urgency in the customer's voice. "Don't throw them out yet? Just wait a second." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open and thumbed through the bills he had inside. He didn't count them. He just checked to see if he had enough. The atmosphere in the shop shifted completely. The cashier stood up straighter, wondering what was going on. The other staff members in the back stopped what they were doing to watch. It felt like a scene in a movie where the music stops and everyone focuses on the main character. "Can I buy them?" the man asked. He looked at the cashier, his eyes intense and serious. "Can I buy the leftovers?" "All of them." The silence that followed was absolute. The cashier blinked at him, her mouth opening slightly. She had worked there for 2 years, and nobody had ever asked to buy the trash. You want to buy the old bread?" she asked, trying to make sense of it. "Why? It's stale. It's not fresh." "I don't care if it's fresh," the man said simply. "It's food, good food. I want to buy it. I'll pay full price. I'll pay whatever you usually charge. Just put it in bags for me instead of the bin." The worker with the tray looked over at the cashier, unsure of what to do. He was holding a tray of scones that were technically trash, but this customer was offering real money for them. It was a confusing situation. They were breaking the routine. In a rigid corporate environment, breaking the routine is scary. "I don't know if I can do that," the cashier said nervously. She looked around as if a manager might suddenly jump out from the back office and fire her on the spot. "The register. It's already counted as waste. If I sell it now, the numbers won't match up." "Write it down as a sale," the man said. He wasn't giving up. He was gentle, but he was persistent. "Sell it to me as a bulk order, or whatever you need to call it. Just please don't throw it away. Look at them," pointed a finger at the tray. "They are perfect. They shouldn't be in the garbage." His passion was disarming. He wasn't asking for a discount. He wasn't trying to scam them. He was literally begging to pay full price for food they were going to throw away. It was such a genuine request that the cashier felt her resistance melting away. She looked at the scones. She looked at the man's tired, earnest face. She realized that this wasn't about the scones. This was about kindness, "'Kay?" she said slowly, a small smile starting to form on her lips. "Okay, if you really want them, I guess I can figure out the register." The worker with the tray lowered his arms, relieved that he didn't have to dump them. "I can box them up for you," he said, his tone changing from bored to helpful. "We have some large boxes in the back. I can fit all of it in there." The man's shoulders relaxed. The tension left his body, replaced by a look of deep gratitude. "Thank you," he said. He said it with such sincerity, like they had just done him a huge favor, even though he was the one paying them and saving the food. "I really appreciate this. Seriously. Give me a few minutes," the worker said, heading to the back to find the boxes. "There's a lot of stuff back there." The man turned back to the counter and waited. He pulled a few crumpled bills out of his wallet and smoothed them out on the counter, preparing to pay. The people in the shop were watching him now with curious expressions. They couldn't understand why a stranger would care so much about a bunch of leftover baked goods. But to the man, it was the most natural thing in the world. He saw a problem, and he found a solution. He didn't do it for applause. He didn't do it to be a hero. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And as he stood there waiting for his boxes of trash, he felt a small sense of peace, knowing that in a few minutes, that food wouldn't be going to a landfill. It would be going to someone who needed it. The worker disappeared into the back room, leaving the bell above the door to jingle softly as it swung closed. For a moment, the only sounds in the shop were the hum of the large refrigerators and the quiet rustle of the man in the cap adjusting his jacket. He didn't look impatient. He didn't check his watch or tap his foot on the floor. He just stood there, calm and composed, as if he had all the time in the world. It was a sharp contrast to the usual energy of the shop, where everyone was always rushing to be somewhere else. Soon, the worker returned. carrying a stack of sturdy cardboard boxes that smelled faintly of cardboard tape and flour. He set them down on the counter next to the register with a heavy thud. He looked at the customer, a mix of curiosity and confusion on his face, but also a new sense of purpose. It felt strange to be packing trash for a paying customer, but it also felt surprisingly good. "All right," the worker said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Let's get this done before the manager comes out back." The man stepped aside to give the worker space. He watched as the boxes began to fill up. It was like a strange reverse assembly line. Usually, they took food out of boxes to put it on display. Now they were taking it off display to put it back into boxes. The worker moved quickly, but with a surprising amount of care. He picked up the tray of scones that had almost been dumped earlier and gently slid them into the first box. Then came the muffins, still plump and moist. Then the croissants, flaky and buttery. "You sure you want all these?" the worker asked as he carried over a tray of bagels. "There's a lot here." "All of them," the man said firmly. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a few more dollars, adding them to the pile on the counter. "Whatever is left? I don't want to leave anything behind." The cashier watched the pile of money grow. It wasn't a small amount. She looked at the boxes, realizing that the customer was essentially buying out the entire day's remaining stock. In a normal situation, this would be a dream sale for a shop clerk. But this felt different. He wasn't buying because he was hungry. He was buying for a reason she could only guess at. She started ringing up the items on the register. But it was difficult because they didn't have a barcode for a mixed box of leftovers. She had to guess at prices, typing in codes for bagels and muffins as fast as she could. The numbers on the screen climbed higher and higher. The man didn't even glance at the screen. He just kept looking at the food, nodding encouragingly every time a new box was filled. As the boxes piled up, the scale of the waste became clear. There were 3 large boxes now, stacked precariously on the counter. They were heavy, bursting with carbohydrates and baked goods. Just 10 minutes ago, this food was destined for the landfill. Now it had value again. It had a purpose. The transformation was entirely thanks to the stranger standing in the worn-out baseball cap. The worker went to the back one last time and returned with a tray of sandwiches. They were the pre-made ones: turkey and cheese, ham and lettuce. They were wrapped in clear plastic. "These two?" he asked. "Especially those," the man said. "Those are important." The worker added the sandwiches to the top of the last box. There was barely any room left. The cardboard lids were bulging, straining against the contents. It was a mountain of food. Enough to feed 20 people, maybe more. The man looked at the stack and let out a small, satisfied sigh. It was the sound of a problem being solved. "Okay," the cashier said, hitting the total button on the register. She felt a bit nervous, worried she might have overcharged him or undercharged him. That comes to a total of, well, quite a bit. The man didn't blink. He pushed the pile of crumpled bills across the counter toward her. "Here you go," he said. "Keep the change." The cashier counted the money. It was more than enough to cover the total. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Really? Are you sure?" "I'm sure," he said. A small, tired smile touched his lips. "You guys work hard. You deal with this stuff all day. It's worth it." The worker finished taping up the last box with a loud rip of the tape dispenser. The sound signaled the end of the transaction. The counter was cleared of food. The trash bin in the corner was empty. The only evidence of the bakery's day was now sitting in cardboard boxes in front of the customer. The staff stood there for a moment, looking at what they had accomplished. It felt like a victory. For the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like they were wasting their time. They felt like they were part of something good. "Can I help you carry these to your car?" the worker asked. He noticed the man was alone, and the boxers looked heavy. "There's no way you can carry all 3 at once." The man shook his head. "I don't have a car," he said simply. "I'm good. I'll make it work." He stepped up to the stack of boxes. He looked like he was calculating the physics of the situation. He picked up the top box, the one with the sandwiches, and tucked it under his left arm. Then, he grabbed the 2 remaining boxes, one in each hand. He grunted slightly with the effort, his muscles tightening under his t-shirt, but he held them steady. It was an awkward, clumsy load. He looked like a pack mule, overloaded but ready for the journey. "You sure?" the worker asked again, opening the door for him. "That looks heavy." "It's okay," the man said, turning sideways to fit through the door with his cargo. "It's not that far, and it's worth the wait." He walked out onto the street, the bell ringing above him to announce his departure. The staff watched through the glass as he stepped out into the cool evening air. He didn't look like a movie star carrying a prop. He looked like a regular guy doing a chore. But there was a lightness to his step now that wasn't there when he came in. The cashier stood at the register, looking at the empty counter, and then at the pile of cash in her hand. She felt strange. It was the end of her shift. She was tired, and usually she would just want to go home and sleep. But now, she felt a buzz of energy. She looked at the worker. "Who was that?" she asked quietly. The worker shrugged, wiping down the counter where the boxers had been. "I don't know. Just a guy. But that was pretty cool, right?" "Yeah," the cashier said, putting the money into the register. "Yeah, it was." She thought about the food. She thought about how easy it would have been to throw it away, just like every other night. She realized that the only thing that stopped them was one person asking a simple question and refusing to take no for an answer. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that he cared enough to stop the routine. He showed them that the food wasn't trash. It was just food, and food belongs to people. Outside, the street was getting darker. The streetlights flickered on, casting long yellow shadows on the sidewalk. The man walked slowly, balancing his precious cargo. He wasn't heading toward the luxury apartments where the wealthy lived. He wasn't heading toward the subway station to go home. He was walking deeper into the neighborhood, toward the park benches and the alleys where the shadows were longest. He was walking toward the people who were invisible to everyone else. And he was bringing dinner. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped away from the warmth of the bakery. But he didn't seem to feel the cold. He was too focused on balancing the 3 large cardboard boxes stacked precariously in his arms. The top box, filled with sandwiches and soft pastries, was tucked securely under his chin, while his hands gripped the bottom 2 boxes. His fingers turning white from the effort of holding so much weight at once. He walked slowly, deliberately, placing one foot carefully in front of the other to avoid tripping on the uneven sidewalk. He didn't turn toward the subway station, and he didn't look for a taxi. Instead, he headed toward the darker corners of the neighborhood. The city around him was changing. The rush of the workday was over, and the streets were filling with a different kind of crowd. The bright lights of the expensive restaurants and bars were flashing, inviting people in for expensive dinners and drinks. But the man walked right past them. He wasn't interested in the glamour. He was on a mission to find the people who had been pushed to the margins, the ones who the city usually tried to ignore. After walking a few blocks, the scenery shifted. The storefronts became grittier, the lights became dimmer, and the doorways became deeper. This was where the shadows lived. He spotted his first recipient sitting in a doorway, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket against the chill. It was an older man, his head bowed, staring at the ground as people walked swiftly past him, pretending he wasn't there. The actor stopped. It was difficult to lower the boxes without dropping them, so he maneuvered carefully until he could set the top 2 down on the pavement next to the man. The sound of the boxes hitting the ground made the older man look up. His eyes were wary, accustomed to being shooed away or yelled at by shopkeepers and police. He expected trouble, but the face looking down at him wasn't angry. It was kind. The man in the cap knelt down, so he was on the same eye level as the seated man. It was a sign of respect. He didn't speak down to him. He didn't act like he was doing a great charitable deed. He just opened the box. The actor said softly, "I have some food here. It's fresh. From the bakery just down the street. You want a sandwich?" The older man looked at the box, then at the actor, confused. "For me?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah, for you," the actor nodded. He reached in and pulled out a turkey sandwich, still wrapped in plastic. He handed it over, then grabbed a croissant and placed it in the man's lap. "There's plenty here. Please, take it. It's going to get cold anyway." The older man took the food like it was made of gold. He held the sandwich with two shaking hands, staring at it. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much. I haven't eaten since yesterday." The actor reached out and gently squeezed the man's shoulder. "I know. It's tough out here. Eat up. Stay warm." He didn't wait for a long conversation. He didn't pull out a phone to take a picture of himself helping the man. He simply stood up, picked up his remaining boxers, and moved on. The older man was left sitting in the doorway. Holding a dinner that an hour ago was destined for the trash, his guard lowered. Feeling a spark of hope in a dark night, a little further down the street, near a park entrance, he saw a younger person sitting on a bench. They had a small backpack and a dog sitting beside them. The actor approached them, setting his boxers down on the bench. The dog perked up, sniffing the air, smelling the bread and meat. "You guys hungry?" the actor asked. The person looked surprised. Is that real food?" "It's real," he said. He began to unpack the box. He gave them sandwiches, muffins, and even a few dog treats he had managed to grab from the bakery counter. "There's water in the fountain over there. It's good food, I promise. I just bought it." He spent the next hour walking up and down the streets. He became a wandering pantry. He found people huddled near vents for heat. He found someone sleeping on a pile of newspapers. To each of them, he gave the same gentle treatment. He looked them in the eye, smiled. He offered food without judgment. He didn't ask them why they were there or how they ended up on the streets. He just treated them like human beings who deserved to eat a decent meal. As the boxers got lighter, his step got lighter too. The physical weight was lifting, but more importantly, a spiritual weight was lifting as well. He knew that for this one night, at least a few dozen people would go to bed with full stomachs. It wasn't solving the problem of homelessness in the city, but it was solving a problem for tonight. It was a small drop in a big ocean, but the ripples mattered. Some people walking by recognized him. They stopped in their tracks, shocked to see a famous movie star standing on a street corner, handing out bagels to homeless people. A few pulled out their phones to record, but most just watched. They didn't interrupt. There was something sacred about the moment. Seeing someone with so much money and so much fame treating the most vulnerable, people with such simple humility made everyone stop and think. It wasn't a photo opportunity. It was just a man doing what he felt was right. Eventually, the last box was empty. He flattened it and tucked it under his arm to recycle later. He looked around. The street was quieter now. The people he had fed were eating, talking softly to each other or to their pets. The mood on the street had changed. The heaviness of the city seemed to have lifted just a little bit. He stood there for a moment, just breathing in the night air. He was alone again, but he wasn't lonely. He felt a deep sense of connection to the city and the people in it. He realized that you don't have to be a politician or a superhero to make a difference. You just have to care enough to ask a question, like what are you going to do with that food? And then be willing to carry the answer, no matter how heavy it is. He pulled his cap down lower and turned his collar up against the wind. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets and began to walk back toward the brighter lights of the main avenue. He disappeared into the crowd, merging back into the millions of stories that make up New York City. But for the people in that neighborhood and for the staff back at the bakery who watched him leave, the story of that night would stay with them for a long time. It was a reminder that kindness doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't need an audience or an award. It just needs someone who is willing to see the value in things that others throw away. Whether it's a tray of leftover pastries or a person sitting in the shadows, and sometimes the simplest act of carrying a few boxes of bread can feed a lot more than just hunger. It can feed the soul of an entire city.